So after investing another roughly 100 hours in the game after launch, I would like to give my thoughts on the class tier list after the nerfs and experiencing more of the game. I want to go through each part of the game and see how the hard nerfs to Druid, Barb, and some of the nerfs to Rogue really impacted the list. But first, we got a word from our sponsor. Today's sponsor is King Arthur Legends Rise by Kabam, an absolutely beautiful mobile RPG based on Arthurian legend, which is really unique. A new trailer recently dropped at the Summer Game Fest, and the characters look absolutely stunning. You can collect characters like Arthur, Kay, Hector, characters you might remember from the Legends of King Arthur. Pre-registration is available now, and this game will be available on PC as well as mobile. So definitely something you're going to want to try out on your PC. At least I will be. This is extremely engaging turn-based combat in this game. Various quests, boss battles, and ways to progress your heroes. My personal favorite was the relic system, which vastly powered up my characters. And I really enjoyed the character progression in general, which oftentimes is one of my favorite parts of mobile RPGs. Definitely give this game a shot and click on the link in the description down below. Wishlist this on Steam and pre-register to stay up to date. You can also follow at PlayKingArthur for more info. Thanks for sponsoring this video. So starting off this list here, I want to mention we have 4 different categories, and the last category is kind of 2 categories. So we're going to go through the 1 to 50 leveling process, the 50 to 70 leveling process, the 70 to 100 leveling process, and then the end game, both solo and group play. Now, the reason I'm breaking it up like this is because at 50, I'm going to suggest that you get to World Tier 3, or that I'm going to assume that you're on World Tier 3 because that matches the capstone dungeon, okay? And that leveling process is way different from the 1 to 50. Same thing goes at level 70, because level 70 to 100 is far, far different from the 50 to 70 because, well, some of the builds actually become online at that point, and a lot of the list changes from what my initial expectations were. With that said, let's dive into the 1 to 50 process, which is something that a lot of people kind of have seen already, and we're going to be putting that list up here like this. So this list here is the 1 to 50 process. Rogue's going to be at the top, Sorcerer and Necromancer are going to be A tier, and Barb and Druid are going to be B tier. Now, with this list, the reason why Rogue is S tier is because the damage available to the Rogue allows you to beat campaign at level 31 easily. I was able to beat the Lilith boss fight really easily without any sort of side leveling, allowing myself to immediately enter World Tier 3 if I wished to do so. So it kind of changes the 1 to 50 process. Not only that, but high damage and high mobility is all that really matters to level up quickly, and the Rogue is best at that. Sorcerer and Necro are on A tier because their mobility is less than the Rogue, but their damage is quite high as well. Necro in particular actually has some of the highest damage numbers earlier on into the game, but they are super slow in terms of no mobility, which is why they're an A tier in the early process, because if they actually had a little bit of mobility, they could arguably be an S tier. But I think the Sorcerer and Necro kind of have a similar experience. I think these are kind of interchangeable, but I personally would vote for the Sorcerer being a little bit better, especially if you run with some of the AoE builds. Then we have the B tier, and I'll put them in B tier because I actually think they're not that bad. They are still very usable, especially if you run like Rend Barb or Pulverized Druid with potentially some companion support earlier on into the game when you don't have any legendary items. It's honestly not terrible, but it is a massive step down from these other classes up here. In fact, you could even argue that Druid is in C tier, in my opinion, simply for the fact that Barbarian tends to be a little bit better than Druid in terms of the early game DPS due to Rend, whereas Druid just has pretty much a massive struggle in terms of just getting the damage out there. Their tankiness is actually not bad. It's that they just don't do a lot of damage. Now, C tier is still passable, and I think that it's probably proper to put them in C tier. So they can do it, and it's okay, but it's certainly not great. And in fact, I think Druid probably needs a little bit of help in terms of this leveling process, and so does Barbarian, honestly. Although Barbarian damage is actually not terrible. It's just the fact that you're a melee class, you're not as fast, etc. So overall, the class tier list for the 1 to 50 process is pretty much going to remain quite similar to what I expected for the overall leveling process previously. Now we dive into the 50 to 70 leveling process. And this is where things start to kind of come together for certain classes a little bit more, okay? And the reason why I'm separating the 50 to 70 process and the 70 to 100 is because at 50, we unlock World Tier 3, which is when we unlock some of the uniques. We also unlock the ability to really amp up our gear with Sacred Gear, and we're actually gonna be able to apply a lot of aspects simply due to the fact that you're actually gonna keep your aspects for quite some time, roughly about 10 hours of potential gameplay from 50 to 70, okay? Potentially more. If you're going to 70 to World Tier 4, then it probably will be even more hours of gameplay. Most people aren't even at this point. Most people are under 50. So this is already a probably top 10, top 20% of the community playing Diablo 4. Rogue, S tier still. And the reason for this is the damage potential is extremely high, and it actually unlocks a new build for you at 50, and that is the Trapper build. The Trapper build actually makes things extremely easy, extremely lazy, and overall just a massive amount of AoE coming out from this build. You can also still run the Poison Imbuement build. It's all very good. Just a massive amount of damage. You really cannot compete with the Rogue earlier on into the game, and it still remains S tier for the 50 to 70 leveling process, okay? Sorcerer. To me, this is still A tier. And the reason for that is the damage is still very high. The Ice Shards build is actually quite solid for its single target DPS, but it also pierces, which makes it very, very solid in terms of clearing out kind of lined enemies. Not quite as good as the Rogue, but still very, very good. And it has a lot of mobility with the teleport. Necromancer. To me, this is where the Necromancer falls off a little bit. And also where it starts to slowly decline as you get later on in the game. Now, again, I want to make this clear. None of these classes are unplayable by any means. But again, you have to compare it to the other classes on top. Otherwise, you're just rating it in a vacuum. And you can do that. But in terms of the tier list here, we got to figure out what the best is. And for me, the Necromancer's damage, while still decent, doesn't really compare to these two classes at this point. And they still lack mobility, which is a big problem. Druid, this is where I think Druid kind of ramps up to a B tier. I still think they're actually behind the Necromancer, but I think that this is where the Druid actually starts to get a little bit more viable options when you start to unlock a little bit of the uniques, especially if you get some of your permanent forms, as well as just overall getting some of the aspects available to you. Now, of course, a lot of these builds can potentially be a little bit of RNG and can move up or down a tier based on the RNG you have available to you. But at least at level 50, what you can do for sure is have the aspects and not have to change them all the time. And remember, at level 50, you also unlock that Paragon board. And this is where some of the glyphs and extra damage ramping can really matter for some classes. And I think Druid fits into that B tier at this point. Barbarian. Now, this is where it gets interesting because to me, Barbarian actually starts to break into the A tier at level 50 to 70, especially towards the later end, towards level 60 to 70. This is where Barbarian starts to potentially get the Whirlwind build online, although a little bit different from the later process, and it starts to kind of annihilate. Again, this is when you start to reach the later stages of level 60 to 70, because they actually have a lot of Paragon nodes that are extremely important for the Whirlwind build and make it extremely viable. But early 50s, it can be a little bit decent. Still good damage, but you're still using Rend potentially. And then as you start to unlock a couple of the aspects and you start to maybe go around the map and get up your codex, if you haven't already, and maybe apply some of the aspects that you have been able to loot, you're really going to start to see the power of the Barb shine. Because at the end of the day, all you really need is the aspects associated with the build in order for it to work, which means that the Barb starts to approach that A tier from the 50 to 70 process. Now we dive into 70 to 100. Now this is where things start to change drastically, because at 70 you unlock Ancestral Gear with World Tier 4. You also unlock, potentially at this point, since you've been farming from 50 to 70, basically any aspect that you would most likely need. Keep in mind that the aspects drop extremely frequently when you enter these later world tiers, and if you spend, the first 2, 3, 4 levels in World Tier 4, you should get basically anything that you want for your build. It's an extremely high drop rate for legendaries and uniques. You oftentimes will get 4 to 5 per dungeon run, and you can oftentimes get 1 to 2 uniques every few dungeon runs, which is really, really crazy. With that said, Rogue, my opinion, still S tier. I think Rogue is actually better than I expected for the end game. And I think this is mainly due to a lot of people thinking that the survivability was low. And while some of it's being carried by the Ancestral Unique or Sacred Unique Temerity, which carries a lot of builds, to be honest, I think that this build with Siphoning Strikes, even if Temerity is nerfed, which very likely that it will, it probably will drop to maybe A tier. But the survivability is actually not as bad as people thought initially. And I think this still is an S tier build just because, or S tier class rather, just because of how much damage they're able to pump out. And to be honest, no class, if you go with the Poison Imbuement build, no class can compete with the single target DPS that the Rogue can pump out. Not a single one after the Barbarian nerfs, which is very, very important because this is when the nerfs start to take effect, realistically. And this is where you really start to feel potentially the pulverized nerfs, the whirlwind nerfs, all the different aspects that are nerfed. However, the nerf to Rogue really doesn't affect it all that much. In the early game process, you still feel the cooldown reduction, and in the end game, you still feel like you can reduce all your cooldowns totally fine, even with the reduction of advanced twisting blades. And the 70 to 100 process is no different. So I think they're still S tier. Now, for the Barbarian here, which I want to also put in the S tier, I think the Barbarian, this is when the Barbarian takes hold of the whole game. In my opinion, as soon as you hit level 70 to 100, this is where the Barbarian absolutely decimates, okay? And the reason why this is the case is you're going to absolutely destroy basically everything with your Whirlwind build. And what I realized with the Rogue, because I've started to play and I was kind of I was like thinking maybe I should rate the Rogue B or A tier because of how powerful the Druid is, right? And the Barbarian is for the leveling process. But to be honest, both of them kind of do a similar thing. And this is why I think Barbarian is so powerful. But the nice thing about Barbarian is that it's just basically permanent, running through everything, killing everything. And you're really tanky while you do it. And this is super powerful. I think the Barbarian is the best farming class when you actually put the build together from the 80 to 100 process, or even the 70 to 100 process, right? If you get the build early enough. Barbarian starts to take over the game. It's really, really powerful, okay? Druid, to me, is going to end up in A tier. When you start to pull together the Shockwave, the aspects that makes the Pulverized build work, or even going with the potential Storm builds, I think it's like a Storm Werewolf build that I've seen, it really starts to pump out damage. In fact, while playing with the Druid, what I've noticed is the Rogue does have a lot of survivability, lots of hits, and lots of mobility, and oftentimes can be more consistent damage, which allows it to be an S tier. The Druid will one-shot things, and that could potentially be stronger in some scenarios than the Rogue, but more often than not, the Rogue is going to outclass the Druid in terms of overall DPS, and that's what makes Rogue S tier, but Druid just inching towards that S tier itself because of the massive amount of burst damage. Now, here's where I have to put the Sorcerer, and I think the Sorcerer actually ends up in A tier. This is where it changes for me from what I expected in the initial iteration of this endgame or the later leveling process. The Sorcerer's Ice Shard damage and overall it's just damage in general, I think the Ice Shards build is very, very good, is just shockingly good, especially for the elites. Okay, their single target damage is comparable, albeit slightly lower, than the Rogue at this point if you're speccing into those Ice Shards and you're trying to abuse them. Okay, which is very, very powerful. You can also get guaranteed crits across the board, which can be extremely powerful as well. And overall, I've just found the Sorcerer to be very high in mobility, very high in damage reduction, and very high in single target damage. Then we have the Necromancer, and unfortunately, I'm gonna have to put the Necromancer in B tier at this point. They are still good, they still do decent damage, but again, this is where the mobility aspect really starts to hurt the Necro. Why do I say that? Well, because before, when you're in World Tier 3, or when you're going through the campaign, etc., you don't need a mobility aspect, pretty much at all. Because you could just kill things. There's no suppressor affects, there's no champions. In World Tier 3, there's a little bit, but not as much as World Tier 4. And with some of these things, you do have to avoid a lot of things coming at you. And every other class, besides potentially the Druid, has a really good way to move around. The Druid, on the other hand, has a lot of Unstoppable, so it can avoid a lot of CC and just overall ability to kind of avoid some of the DPS or just tanky enough, right? The Necro has a couple of problems, and you have to play relatively safe. And so because of that, it actually slows down the leveling process quite significantly. So to me, Necro is going to be in B tier. Now here's where we get into the solo endgame. And what I mean by solo endgame is we are now level 100 and we are looking to push Nightmare Dungeons. Now I've gotten up to 65, almost 70. I've almost beaten a 70 Nightmare Dungeon on the Rogue. So I'm kind of starting to see where the cracks fill in for the Rogue and where some of the other classes can kind of shine. So to me, we're gonna start off with the Rogue because that's my class. We're gonna put it in the A tier. Still good, still very good. And in fact, I think that it's actually going to be one of the builds that you can potentially push. And I think this is where the Trapper versus Poison Imbuement build kind of starts to fill in why some of the tankiness is a little bit better. Now, if they nerf Temerity, I think Rogue drops quite significantly to B tier. But with Temerity, I think they're very, very unkillable. And unless you're going to get absolutely one-shot, like legitimately one-shot through 2 health bars, you are almost unkillable on the Rogue, as long as you're playing well. With the Trapper build, with the Poison Imbuement build, you can actually push potentially higher because your damage is higher. The problem with that is that you really, really need to be playing very well to dodge everything basically that the mobs have to throw at you. So to me, the Rogue ends up in an A tier, not as squishy as people might think, but also not as tanky as some of the classes above. Barbarian ends up in S tier once again. Again, they just have so much potential with some damage reductions. They have so much potential with how much damage they're able to do. Again, compared to the Rogue, they do just so much consistent, massive crit, massive damage, while also being incredibly tanky, which is very, very important overall for solo pushing, because you need to be very survivable. Otherwise, if you're getting one shot, you're just going to use up the revives, and you're just going to not be able to beat the Nightmare Dungeon. On top of that, what's really nice about the Barbarian is that you can oftentimes move very, very quickly and just kill things on the way. Whereas the Rogue, you oftentimes have to kind of aim your abilities a little bit better, and it ends up being a little bit more complicated. Next build is the Druid, or class rather, and they are also going to enter the S tier. What's interesting about the Druid, and specifically with the Pulverized build, is that you actually become sort of a pseudo-ranged class. And on top of that, you're very tanky. And because you one-shot, oftentimes, you can actually push a little bit higher because you don't have to stay in the fight killing everything over and over and over again, or hitting everything over and over again. Whereas the Rogue and the Barbarian actually have to do that to some degree. The Druid can come in with an overpower hit and annihilate monsters, which is really powerful. Although they can do that, the Barbarian is going to end up clearing a little bit quicker and is generally a little bit tankier than the Druid from what I've seen in terms of the way the builds play out. The Druid can potentially become a little bit tankier, but the way the Whirlwind Barb versus the Pulverized Potential Storm builds work, I found the Barbarian to be a little bit tankier and have a little bit more value overall compared to just being able to one-shot things. But they're still extremely good and worth S tier in my opinion, and definitely better than the Rogue. B tier, I'm going to put Sorcerer. One of the biggest problems with the Sorcerer is actually the fact that it's ranged. Now you might see that and be like, why does that matter? You kind of want a ranged class, isn't that an advantage? In this game, I find range to be a disadvantage. And the main reason for that is when we're doing a Nightmare Dungeon, there's 2 things that are going to pop up quite frequently. Champions and suppressors. You have to be able to deal with both of those affixes and both of those mechanics in a Nightmare Dungeon, as well as high burst damage and as well as just doing high damage yourself. The Sorcerer has actually quite solid damage reduction. It also has a really good damage and comparable to potentially the Barbarian or the Rogue in terms of just consistent damage. However, because it's ranged, you need to be able to get that damage off by getting on top of someone, but the build doesn't really function nearly as well if you're on top of someone, unlike the Melee Twisting Blades Rogue or the Whirlwind Barb. And because of this, you can't really deal with suppressors all that well, and if you have to deal with a champion, then this becomes a very big complication because you cannot damage anyone if you have not the champion killed. And so this is where it becomes really, really annoying, and the Sorcerer to me ends up in B tier. Lastly, we have the Necromancer, and to me they're going to be C tier. And again, this is where another portion of the Necro mobility becomes a huge handicap. 70 to 100, yeah, you don't have mobility to farm, so you're not as fast. That's fine. You might die more often because you can't avoid things. That's fine. In Nightmare dungeons, there are things that are almost impossible to avoid unless you have some sort of mobility, or just in general being able to kite out the monsters, especially with a bone spear or bone spirit build. It's just going to be so much harder to deal with almost anything. Things like random affixes in the dungeons are going to be super hard to deal with. Some of the suppressors and champions, like I said with the sorcerer, are going to be hard to deal with because you're a ranged class. And on top of all that, you're just going to not have any ability to kind of hop on and deal with those. If I see a champion, if I see a suppressor on the rogue, druid, or barbarian, I run at it and I kill it. Whirlwind just murders it, rogue teleports and kills it, or druid one-shots it. The sorcerer and necro cannot do that, and necro in particular cannot move around to deal with those things, making it far, far worse in solo endgame pushing. And I think that overall ends up being a little bit lackluster as a solo class. Now, jumping into the group endgame, this is where it gets a little bit interesting because we're going to be group pushing things like Nightmare 80s, Nightmare 90s, Nightmare 100s. And I've played with every class in my group, and there are some things that I've found are really, really effective and some things that are not. First off, I want to start with the Barbarian. They're an S tier. And in my opinion, I think Barbarian's probably the only S tier class in this scenario. Why is that? Well, because they offer so many options with their shouts, while also providing some of the highest DPS in the game. They're a great support, but also great damage dealer. And with that combination, I mean, you got something really powerful on your hands for group play, okay? The amount of damage they can provide for your whole team by buffing them up, the amount of resource generation you can provide for your whole team, super, super powerful. And even things like taunting, damage reduction, things like that. So, so good to have a druid in your party or your barb in your party because they're just buffing you by nature of them playing the game. That's super strong. The next class is going to be druid. Druid's actually the highest DPS class that I've seen in group play by far. The thing with the druid is when you have people in front of you kind of grouping up the enemies for you, you actually scale your damage exponentially. And I've seen it pop off for multiple millions of damage easy with Pulverize. And this makes it extremely powerful as a DPS spec. And I think that druid actually does the highest DPS out of any class when you're talking about the group play. Because you start to get buffs from Barb, you might start to get buffs from other classes. Even itself gets buffed up from its own traits with grouping and things like that. The setup from other classes benefits the Druid more than any other class for its damage numbers. It also has a little bit of CC and a little bit of group buffs. But I would say that it's a step down from Barbarian, but not by a ton. So maybe it is an S tier build, but definitely worse than the Barbarian, but not a ton. But I think A tier is probably a fair example of it because although it does more damage than either class, it's burst damage. And while you can rotate around that, it will potentially not do insane amounts more damage than some other classes like the Barb or the Rogue, which in my opinion, Rogue is also A tier. And this might be something that surprises some of you because in previous videos, I mentioned how the Rogue doesn't really have anything to offer in groups, but actually with me using the Trapper build in group play, it has become my favorite thing to do. Because what happens is with the Trapper build with Temerity, you are unkillable and you could actually be a frontline support for your team while also offering decent damage and grouping up and CCing your enemies. You actually have some of the highest CC in the entire game when you start to run off of the Trapper build because you start to daze, which allows you to knock down, which allows you to knock down more with Poison Trap, which allows you to reset your cooldowns, which allows you to group up people with Death Trap, knock them down again, and the cycle goes on and on. By grouping them up with Death Trap, knocking them down, you can get 2 potential bonuses for the Druid, which allows you to activate things like grouping up effects from the Druid, but also damage to stun, damage to CC'd enemies, which is extremely powerful with the Trapper Rogue. Next up, we have the Sorcerer and Necro. And this is where it gets a little bit interesting. I think the Sorcerer actually ends up being extremely good, but not quite as good as the Druid and Rogue. This tier with the group play, because you have so many combinations, it's kind of hard to rate each build in each class. But I would say that the Sorcerer ends up in B tier and so does the Necromancer. But I think the Sorcerer is actually a little bit better than Necromancer, unfortunately for the Necromancer. What I found, first I'll talk about the Sorcerer because I think that's a little bit more quicker. To me, the thing that I found Necro to be good at, Rogue does better. And If Rogue does it better, then Necro to me is just kind of awkward because it has no niche use that ends up making it the class to pick. So that means that to me it's the kind of least sought after option, which is why it's at the bottom in B tier. However, the Sorcerer actually has very good damage, more damage than the Rogue, and has the ability to provide a little bit of CC, as well as some other options to CC, like the chill effect. I think Ice Shards is the most prominent build, but you can also run things like Firewall, and Firewall in other scenarios is kind of awkward because you have to group them up yourself. But with the Druid, with the Barbarian, with the Rogue builds kind of in place, you can actually get grouped up and then just burn them away with Fireball absolutely, or Firewall absolutely annihilate things, okay? This is where those types of builds kind of start to come in, but you can also run, like I said, Ice Shards to just provide that additional CC for your teammates and do really, really solid piercing damage, which once again turns into a very good AoE due to grouping up your enemies with the Rogue or the Barbarian. I think the Rogue and Barbarian are the best setup classes, while the Druid and Sorcerer ends up providing a lot of the DPS, but also some of these sought after sort of additional support mechanics. Druid in particular kind of does a lot of support while also offering some of the highest DPS, whereas Barbarian offers the best support from what I've seen, while also offering potentially the second most DPS. So that in combination makes an S tier. Then we have the Druid, then we have the Rogue, then we have the Sorcerer and Necro. People highly underrated the Rogue, even myself, who I believe put at the end of the list in group play, but ends up being extremely viable with the Trapper build in group play. That build is extremely good, specifically with the modification that I ran, which is Temerity plus the Siphoning Strikes, which allows you to get the barrier. That barrier keeps you alive and allows you to support your entire team throughout the whole dungeon. Super, super strong. That's going to be the group endgame, and that is going to be the end of the tier list. Overall, really quickly, how would I rate these classes? Well, I'd probably put them in this kind of category. Because although the Druid is annihilating sort of the closer to endgame, the early game kind of leaves them back. Sorcerer, just overall a solid class throughout the game, and Necromancer I think lags behind, but the Rogue still powerful in the end game, but extremely strong in the early game, and the Barbarian kind of a similar thing where although it's a little bit weaker in the early game, it actually powers up past the Rogue as you start to level, and it's just annihilating the end game. So overall, that's where I'd put the classes, and that's going to be the end of the tier list. Some of the nerfs really affected some of the classes, and yet they are still on top. The Barb, even with the half damage reduction, basically, it's still insane. It's still insane, still has so much support to offer. Druid, if it didn't get nerfed, I could see it being better than the Rogue. The problem is that the nerf for Druid actually hindered its damage quite significantly, and with the Rogue nerfs, it didn't actually affect the Rogue that much. In fact, I think out of the three classes that got the nerf the most, which is Druid, Barb, Rogue, I think the Rogue got the easiest of all the nerfs, and the Barbarian got hit with the hardest, and yet because the build for the Barb was so broken, the nerfs actually just brought it more in line with other builds. And one thing I'll say about all the classes on this list, a lot of this is based on a single or two builds. If the Whirlwind Barb got nerfed again, this would change drastically. If the Rogue Twisting Blade skill got nerfed more, or the traps potentially, or Poison Imbuement got nerfed more, we could drop that significantly. If the Druid Pulverize or the Storm aspect build got nerfed, it could be dropped, right? Same thing goes with the Necromancer and Sorcerer. If the Ice Shards got buffed, or Firewall got buffed, or if Bone Spear got buffed, it could raise up as well. It really just depends on how they handle the nerfs and buffs going forward, and whether or not we're going to have a single build spec for every class. Because to be honest, most often these classes have a single core skill that is extremely strong and the other ones that are just decent. And that's typically every single build. Hopefully you enjoyed, guys. I know this was a longer video, but timestamps are in the description down below. So if you wanted to check out anything specific, it's down there. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like, sub to the channel, and I'll see you all for the next one.